explained when he testified before this committee. One of the primary sources of stagnant growth and unrest in developing economies is a lack of property rights and the resulting exclusion of workers, including women, from the formal economy. These constraints directly harm women by preventing them from working, from saving, from controlling their own future. And they also harm economic growth and they harm stability. In fact, a multitude of studies project huge gains of global GDP from increases in women's economic participation. Perhaps that is why, after De Soto helped reform the customary laws in his native Peru to make it easier for Peruvian women to work and to own property, women's formal labor force participation increased by 15% in that country. As a result, Peru became one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. We have reason to be optimistic that this type of success can be replicated. More developing nations are beginning to understand the importance of women's economic inclusion and are taking steps to reform their laws and to address inequities. The U.S. has a critical leadership role to play in continuing to promote such reforms. Our economic, humanitarian, conservation, and many other interests around the world are better served when women are empowered and when economies are growing. And fortunately, new technologies are making women's economic participation more possible than ever. In decades past, microfinance loans were championed to combat extreme poverty. But microfinance is not a cure-all for those living in poverty, particularly those women who face so many additional challenges to their economic empowerment. In recent years, however, an exciting array of financial technologies like mobile money have sprung up across the developing world. This presents tremendous opportunity for impoverished communities and women in particular. And so I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel today about how the U.S. government can better help ensure women's inclusion in the rise of Microfinance 2.0. And I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Engel, for his remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Ambassador Verveer, I'm especially grateful that you were able to join us. I know you had to rearrange some travel to be here. Your work as our country's first ever ambassador at large for global women's issues made a lasting difference all over the world, and I hope that the administration sees the value of this position and appoints a new ambassador soon, along with so many other positions at stake awaiting nominees. We use the word, and I want to thank Dr. Suri and Ms. Iskendrian. Hope I didn't butcher that. Thank you so much. We look forward to all of you testifying. We use the word empowerment a great deal when it comes to women's and girls' issues, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. Women and girls are powerful, and we know what happens when that power and potential are unleashed. Communities thrive, local and global communities grow, societies prosper, and become more inclusive and equitable. If women were full participants in the global economy, we would see an additional $12 through $28 trillion in growth in global GDP by the year 2025. Certain innovations, such as microfinance and mobile banking, have driven progress in women's economic participation, but they aren't close to a silver bullet. A woman without a mobile phone cannot take advantage of these tools. A woman without a birth certificate might not even be able to open a bank account. And in too many places around the world, much bigger roadblocks stand in the way of women exercising their full potential, roadblocks caused by poverty or lack of opportunity or by legal barriers or cultural and societal norms that treat women as second-class citizens. So when it comes to promoting economic access and participation for women, I think we should focus on getting these obstacles out of the way and make it easier for women and girls around the world to put their power to work. Now, in my view, making economies more inclusive for women is simply the right thing to do. It's just wrong that women anywhere are denied access to the same economic opportunities as men, and that's true in the United States as well. We might not want to deal with it, we might not want to confront it, but it's true. But this is the Foreign Affairs Committee, so we also need to ask, why is women's economic opportunity a foreign policy priority? Well, it's easy. All those benefits of women's full economic participation I mentioned earlier, stronger, more stable societies, are also in our national interest. We want to see economies thrive, governments become more responsive, countries become stronger partners on the global stage. Full participation of women is directly tied to these outcomes. So from a strategic standpoint, this is good, smart policy that strengthens American security. The aim of our policy, then, should be to identify and meet the challenges that hold women back from full economic participation. When we start to look at those challenges, we find that women's economic participation is closely tied to a range of other issues that disadvantage women and girls in the developing world. For example, a young girl who's denied an education won't become financially literate or learn the skills needed to compete in the marketplace. Girls forced into child marriage won't have a chance to contribute to their local economies. Women who are victims of gender-based violence and domestic abuse are less likely to get ahead economically. Perhaps most importantly, access to quality health care, including family planning, is critical to women's economic success. The evidence is indisputable. Improving women's access to contraception improves their economic well-being. Women who are able to plan and even delay childbirth are more likely to get an education, raise their standards of living, and climb out of poverty. That's one reason American policy has focused on expanding access to family planning around the world. These efforts have seen good results. In the 27 countries with the biggest USAID-supported programs, the rate of modern contraception use has risen from under 10% a half-century ago to 37% today. A good jump, but it shows we still have a long way to go. Now, the Trump administration has said that it supports efforts to empower women and girls around the world, but its budget proposal tells a different story. The Trump budget completely zeroes out funding for international family planning and reproductive health and eliminates American support for the United Nations Population Fund, the largest purchaser and distributor of contraception globally. On top of that, the administration has reinstated and expanded the global gag rule, which we know has devastating effects on women's health around the world. This is a disgrace which will set women back across the globe. Addressing women's economic participation requires a broad-based, integrated, detail-oriented, and comprehensive approach that deals with all the issues I mentioned, plus a host of others. The wrong approach is to cut our diplomacy and development by nearly a third. Fortunately, Congress has the last word on how much we spend on foreign policy priorities, and I'll continue to fight for a robust investment in these areas. So I look forward from hearing from our three excellent panelists on these issues, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for calling attention to this issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. So this morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel which includes Ms. Mary Ellen Iskandarian, and she's president and CEO of Women's World Banking, which is a nonprofit devoted to helping low-income women in developing countries access key financial tools and resources. And we have Dr. Tavneet Seri, Associate Professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. She focuses on the impact of digital finance services in developing economies. And we have Ambassador Milan Verveer, who served as former Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the State Department, and she currently is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. And if we could ask everyone to summarize your remarks, that would be best, and then we'll go to the questions. So, Ms. Iskandarian, if you would like to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Mary Ellen Iskandarian, and I'm President and CEO of Women's World Banking. For nearly 40 years, we have listened to low-income women in developing countries describe their need for financial services and then worked with local banks, insurance companies, and increasingly cell phone companies to tailor convenient and affordable savings, insurance, and credit products to meet those needs. Women's World Banking currently works with 49 partners in 32 countries to reach 44 million clients. But Women's World Banking can't do this alone. The Global Findex tells us that 1.1 billion women, more than half of the world's unbanked population, do not have an account at a bank, while hundreds of millions more do not have access to the full set of financial products. In addition, women own roughly 1/3 of the 200 million businesses in emerging economies that have no or insufficient access to credit. Providing these women with basic financial services, that fundamental first step toward economic empowerment, can unlock unprecedented economic growth and job creation, and can have a direct impact on development outcomes such as health, education, food security, and water and sanitation. Women spend, save, and invest money in profoundly different ways than men. One such difference: when women have discretion over their financial choices, they prioritize spending on their families. On average, women spend 90 cents out of every dollar earned on education, healthcare, and housing, in comparison to men's 60 cents. Improving a woman's financial access brings with it a multiplier effect that will be critical to realizing the potential of financial inclusion for reducing poverty and driving economic growth. I'm pleased to note that you've entitled this hearing Beyond Microfinance. The traditional microfinance institutions established an important principle. Low-income people, and women in particular, can borrow responsibly. But over the years, we've learned that, like all of us, low-income people have complicated financial lives that require more than just a one-size-fits-all microloan. Fortunately, a broad range of providers, including mainstream commercial banks and insurance companies, as well as payments providers, mobile network operators, and fintech companies, has emerged to meet these needs. Yet low-income women face a number of barriers that hinder their access to these services. I'll touch briefly on just 3 of them, along with some potential solutions. First, millions of women lack the documentation and other forms of identification to open even a simple savings account. India has recently implemented an innovative biometric ID system that has dramatically expanded access to financial services. Elsewhere, tiered Know Your Customer requirements allow women to open no-frills savings accounts with minimal documentation. The second barrier women face is a lack of collateral. Women generally have fewer assets to pledge to a bank, and in many countries are legally barred from owning or inheriting land. In response, some countries have established movable collateral registries that better reflect the types of assets women can provide to satisfy bank requirements. Finally, more than 1.7 billion women in low and middle income countries do not even own a cell phone. This lack of access to technology, combined with lower financial and digital literacy, prevents them from fully utilizing digital financial services. Once women gain access to their own phones and some basic training, however, their usage levels parallel men's. Despite these barriers, I'm optimistic about the opportunities presented by women's financial inclusion. The United States can play an important role in accelerating those opportunities by joining other developed countries that are investing in women's financial inclusion, often led by their country's gender ambassadors. The United States can use its influence at the G20 and other fora to push for implementation of more national financial inclusion strategies that have explicit gender targets. USAID, OPIC, and even EXIM could catalyze more private sector investment by including requirements in their programs to serve women. They could also engage in public-private partnerships that serve to de-risk private sector investment. Distinguished committee members, thank you for calling attention to the role that women's financial inclusion plays in building stronger families, communities, and economies.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee for hosting this hearing and giving me the opportunity to provide testimony on empowering women in the developing world. I would like to offer 3 main messages today. First, although there has been truly remarkable progress in alleviating global poverty across the world, the progress of women has not kept up with that of men. We have a long way to go towards gender equality in the developing world. For example, only 39% of the total workforce is female. Only 38% of businesses are female-owned, even in part. Second, all that said, it turns out that a number of private sector digital financial technologies are helping even poor women in remote areas join the economy and manage their money more effectively, with profound effects on their economic status and empowerment. Third, to date, though the private sector has created and provided these tools at scale, international aid played a critical role. In this case, millions of digital transactions each day in poor countries can be traced back to a small decision by the UK's International Development Agency to fund a pilot of a new idea. Good data-driven thinking, which brings together government and private sector innovations, can bring big payoffs. This hearing is aptly titled Beyond Microfinance. For many years, microfinance was thought to be key to lifting poor women out of poverty. We now have very strong evidence from 7 different countries showing that it simply does not. There is now a consensus amongst economists that this method, putting poor people into debt, is not an effective long-term poverty solution. But there are new findings suggesting that another area of finance does empower women: mobile money. In the US, services like Venmo or Apple Pay are just taking off. So it may be surprising to hear that Kenya's mobile money system, M-Pesa, has been around for 10 years. It lets people send money to one another with just a text message, so it works even on the simplest mobile phone. And this technology has taken the developing world by storm. There are twice as many mobile money payments every day as there are PayPal ones. There are over 400 million accounts in the developing world, more than half of these in sub-Saharan Africa alone. With my colleague Billy Jack at Georgetown, over the past 8 years, I've been studying what happened to communities in Kenya as M-Pesa spread across the country. The first thing we saw was how families deal with financial emergencies. The poor are never more than one emergency away from financial disaster. When a child gets sick, you'll do whatever you have to help them get better. The same holds for Kenyans. But in many families, this meant reducing the amount of food, other basic necessities, or even pulling their kids out of school to be able to pay for medicine. When M-Pesa arrived, families could now phone a friend for help. They could get money from a cousin across the country or a friend in the city. Then in turn, when that friend had an emergency, they'd repay the favor. A few years later, we looked at the broader impact of mobile money. When M-Pesa came to an area, it reduced poverty. It lifted an estimated 194,000 households, 2% of Kenyan households, out of extreme poverty. When we dug deeper, we found something we're not used to seeing. The anti-poverty effects were much stronger for women. In fact, an estimated 186,000 women in Kenya were able to switch from subsistence farming into business and sales occupations. Just giving women more privacy, flexibility, control, and the ability to manage the kinds of financial risks they face seems to have been a massive economic boon to them. And all that from a simple technology. Remember, it doesn't give people cows or loans or any entrepreneurial savvy they didn't have before. Our results on women's empowerment are now supported by fresh-off-the-presses work showing that cash grants have effects on male-run businesses and not on female-run businesses. But this is in part because even when women are given cash, often their husbands control where it goes. And in India, making government welfare payments electronic and giving women control of those payments by depositing the cash in their bank accounts improved their economic outcomes. One key message from the M-Pesa story is how it started. An idea of 2 employees at the private cell phone company Vodafone in the UK, a pilot paid for by the UK's equivalent of USAID, and a resulting scalable, highly profitable business model. There is essentially no private sector R&D in developing countries, and aid money here acted as crucial R&D capital for the firm. Supporting these sorts of digital innovations and technologies will be key to closing the gender gap in economic opportunities in the developing world. Thank you again for having me, and I'll look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you. Ambassador Verveer.
Chairman Royce and Congressman Engel and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on an issue of critical importance, increasing women's economic participation and empowerment in developing nations. Mr. Chairman, let me begin by thanking you for your leadership in focusing on global women's issues. They are in the vital interest of the United States. Countries with declining living standards and inequality are more unstable and pose greater challenges to our own interests and our own security. Empowering women and girls is fundamentally a moral issue, a human rights issue. It is also smart and it is strategic. It advances our foreign policy as it tackles some of the most pressing issues that confront the globe and America's leadership. This hearing has to do with one of the great challenges worldwide. How do we grow economies, create jobs, and ensure inclusive prosperity? Today, there is a growing body of empirical evidence demonstrating the positive impact of investing in women and girls, from the World Bank to the World Economic Forum, from countless think tanks and private sector analysts. We know that women represent one of the most powerful economic opportunities the world has ever seen. The McKinsey Global Parity Report found that closing the global gender gap could drive more than $12 trillion in growth by 2025, if, and this is a big if, much more is done to tackle the obstacles that continue to hold women back. Microenterprise development has played an important role in lifting up women at the bottom of the pyramid. However, for them to grow out of their subsistence businesses is not easy. As you've heard, credit is not enough. An intensive package of high-potential interventions is required. Studies show that women-run SMEs are accelerators of economic growth. SMEs occupy that critical space in economies where jobs are created and economies grow. Yet if women are to unleash their potential, we must confront and reduce the barriers they confront. They face greater roadblocks than their male counterparts in starting and expanding businesses. Discriminatory laws and customs impede women's efforts. Violence against women is a global scourge. In some places, women have no rights to inheritance nor property, and very little in the way of legal protection. Women often lack training, mentors, networks, access to technology, markets, and access to finance, as you've heard, is particularly challenging. For female entrepreneurs to unleash their potential, addressing these obstacles will be essential. Women are also vital to the agriculture sector, and in many developing countries, they are the backbone of their economies. Yet subsistence-level women farmers do not have equal access to the resources which limit their productivity. A seminal FAO report showed that when women farmers can operate on a level playing field, including having land ownership, they can increase their individual yields significantly. Technology has the potential to revolutionize women's lives in the developing world by providing critical access to information, mitigating health and safety risks, creating opportunity for financial security and independence. Yet mobile technology, as essential a tool as it is still out of reach for many poor women. Its greatest impact will be in mobile banking, which enables women to make the financial transactions that they need and to keep their money safe. But the genuine good news here is that strides are being made in digital financial services that are indeed transforming women's lives. The challenge we are addressing today is multifaceted, as must be any solution. No one investment constitutes a silver bullet. Many development investments are interrelated. Programs like women's health, education, freedom from violence, and legal rights are critically important to economic empowerment. And a federal budget that drastically cuts these programs will only shortchange women, but not only the women around the world, it will also shortchange the interests of the United States. I hope that the committee will also urge the administration to fill the position of Ambassador for Global Issues for the reasons that I've laid out in my testimony. Today, some of the largest and most far-sighted companies understand that engaging in partnerships to advance women brings benefits both to society and to companies themselves. Public-private partnerships recognize that no one sector has the monopoly on competencies that are required in this field, nor the resources, but together much can be achieved. And I lay out ways that companies today are engaged in these partnerships through value chain sourcing, digitizing financial services, and so much more. The United States should continue to catalyze, support, and participate in impactful and innovative partnerships among many stakeholders. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I thank the panelists. And when we look at, your testimony, there are a lot of things that jump out that are really quite surprising. And Dr. Suri, you mentioned your research on mobile phones in Kenya. I think, again, what you just said was 186,000 women made the decision as a result of this new form of employment to move from subsistence farming to move into business or to move into sales. And yet, maybe you didn't see the same changes with men, but you saw this enormous shift. I think this is key, but could you explain maybe a little more of why you think this occurred?
Thank you, Chairman Royce. So that's exactly right. We did not see men shift occupational choice or switch their kind of decision of where their income is coming from, but women did, and that number's correct, 186,000. So we can't pinpoint exactly why, but we can tell you kind of the two sort of leading hypotheses, which are supported by the other work that was in my testimony. So one of them is that what M-Pesa or mobile money did was provide extra resilience. So you might have heard the term higher risk, higher return. Women weren't taking advantages of higher risk, higher return because they were worried about the downside risk. They were worried that if something goes wrong, I still need to feed my kids, educate my kids. And so when mobile money came along and gave them this protection from their social network, they were able to take advantage of these higher risk, higher return opportunities like a business, like sales. So I think that's part of the story. I think the other part of the story is it gives them control. A lot of these women actually do have cell phones, and they're able to save on their phones through mobile money, and it gives them a sense of access and control to what's on their phone. And so I think both of those components probably explain these findings for women.
So they exert ownership, or they exert control
Absolutely.
over what is one's property.
Absolutely.
And that's something that men maybe already have, but now that women are empowered in that way, they basically have a secure property right here, and that lets them assume greater risk, as you said, which
Correct.
is the driver of innovation, driver of economic growth.
Yeah, I like what you said when you opened. You said something about women controlling their future.
Yeah.
I think this allows women to control a bit more of their future.
Another question here, and I'll ask the panel, but developing countries are increasingly coming to recognize the importance of women's economic inclusion. So we see countries from Jordan to Kenya, as you pointed out, to Nicaragua. They have reformed their laws in recent years to improve women's property rights, but this change takes time. And we have, a Millennium Challenge Corporation here in our diplomacy that we use for leverage. And we've had some success in encouraging reforms in exchange for U.S. investment. And I would just ask the members of the panel here, how can we encourage more reforms, and what should we be focusing on in that effort? Ambassador.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman, and it is true that without the kinds of reforms and legal protection, women are not able to progress as they might in the economic sphere. I think what the MCC has done over a longer-term trajectory, as it's organized to do, it certainly has a very strong gender component to its work, and also is holding governments using the leverage of America's investment, as you say. I think the private sector, too. Mobile companies, for example, who go in to ask for expansions of regulatory opportunities could also be raising issues about women's legal protections or ways in which women can enhance their standing. So I think we need a combination of people who talk to governments, as each and every one of you does when you are on a CODEL or when they're coming here, to raise these issues. You know, we talk about them as women's issues, but they are far more than women's issues. They peculiarly affect women, there's no doubt about it. But they they have a great deal to say about all of society and certainly how economies function. So I think we should not diminish the aggregation of all of the ways to influence governments in making the right decisions.
And I wanted to ask Ms. Iskandarian this question too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to build on Ambassador Vivier's comments, it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but what gets measured gets done. And I think one thing that MCC in particular, but certainly any other agencies that are interacting with our nations abroad and developing countries, can insist that tracking the data, tracking the number of women that are being served, is done. Only 34% of cell phone companies today that are offering mobile money services even know the gender of their clients. So we can't even really assess the nature, the full nature of the problem until we actually know who's being served, who's not being served, and how they may be different. We saw, both of the panelists referred to, as huge improvements in financial inclusion between 2011 and 2014 in the run-up to the Global Findex report. The biggest changes were in those countries that had specific national financial inclusion strategies that had specific gender targets. That would be such an easy thing for us to include in anything that we require of a government that we're providing funding to.
Very good. My time's expired. Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Verveer, let me ask you this. Thank you again for coming here. And I have two questions. While empowering women economically is certainly aligned with America's values, it's also in America's U.S. national security and foreign policy interests because it promotes peace and stability in fragile states. And you've done a lot of work in Georgetown, and during your time at the State Department as the first U.S. ambassador on global women's issues, on the link between women's economic empowerment and national security. So I would ask you, in general, how does empowering women promote U.S. foreign policy, national security, and economic interests? And what role did empowering women economically have in Rwanda in terms of economic growth, but also post-conflict peace and stability?
Congressman Engel, I think the connectivity between women's economic agency and participation and peace and security is one that is increasingly linked and one that we are recognizing as critically important. And I know that this panel had a previous hearing in this whole area of women, peace, and security and what their agency represent. We know that in those societies where the condition of women is one where they are oppressed and denied their rights, those conditions often are the first signs of increased instability and potential conflict. And I often feel as though women are the canaries in the mines. Look at what's happening to the women, and you will have a sense of what is to come down the pike if we have the vision and the ability to look at those conditions and take them seriously. I think one of the most important elements as we take hopefulness out of situations where countries are coming out of conflict is to appreciate that you can have the best peace agreement, but if the key issues that affect the people on the ground, and one of the critical ones is their economic future, are not weighed into those agreements and then are not executed in a recovery process, you're not going to have that long-term sustainable peace that an agreement hopefully would guarantee. And in a place like Rwanda, for example, there was a recognition, and while so many lives were lost, that women had to play a critical role. Today, they comprise some 60% of their parliament, the highest women's participation in legislatures in the world. They are active in ministries. They are active in every facet of the decision-making processes in Rwanda. And I think, to some extent, whatever you think of President Kagame, he has recognized that the empowerment of women has played a major difference in moving his country forward. In my testimony, I note one of the projects that I've been involved in that included a private sector company, Kate Spade and Company, which made a business investment in Rwanda specifically for business results, but also to empower women. And what we've seen in the case studies that have been done on that investment is what a difference it is making, not only in terms of their business investment, but particularly in terms of women's economic empowerment and social progress for those women and their community. So again, the link between economic participation, economic viability, opportunity, and sustainable peace and the amelioration of conflict and the avoidance of conflict go absolutely hand in hand.
Thank you. Let me ask Mrs. Kandarian this question. What steps do you believe that the administration should take to promote the economic empowerment of women? How and why should they target women from poor rural communities just as equally as those living in urban centers that already have access to the formal economy or banking? And finally, what good does incentivizing legal and policy reform do for women from all socioeconomic backgrounds?
That's a tall order. I think
and you have 18 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think just to make one clarifying point, that urban-rural divide that you mentioned, yes, one of the very exciting things about mobile money is that we are able to reach rural populations that are so much, that have been so excluded. But just because a woman is in an urban area doesn't necessarily mean that she has access to financial services. In far too many places, we still see the formal financial sector has, for example, very, very high minimum balance requirements, for example. There is a very strong sentiment on the part of low-income men and women that the financial sector doesn't really want them. But I think for women, there's also this emotional distance, so to speak, that they really do not feel respected. Their savings are not necessarily wanted. But those banks that do make that commitment, that do make that leap into this new market, find that women are really excellent clients. They tend to be the savers. Their savings accounts are the stickier savers. They are more willing to buy cross-sold products than men are. They buy more insurance than men do. Lots of very good benefits. And so I think to whatever extent this administration can continue to foster that support specifically from the private sector. And as I mentioned in my remarks, I think there is a great deal we can do in de-risking. We've seen a number of the development finance institutions from other developed countries are providing that kind of support, first loss guarantees, that first step into a market that supports a private sector player, but then as they get used to that market, they see that this is a good form of investment, that support can be lessened.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, before I go back, I just ask for unanimous consent to enter CARE's written testimony into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Eliana Ross Latenan of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for convening this important hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for excellent testimony. With so much going on around the world, the Syria conflict, the Iranian nuclear deal, North Korea's ballistic missiles, and everything in between, lamentably, we often overlook the plight of women in the developing world and our role and our responsibility for helping these women. We know that women in many developing countries oftentimes face insurmountable legal, cultural, and religious barriers to becoming the full and equal members of society that must be their natural right. Not only is this a travesty for the rights of women, but in many of these countries, when women have the same rights and access as men, the transition from developing to developed countries becomes a reality. Preventing half of your population from access to the job market and thus the financial tools to help promote economic growth is just unconscionable. It is imperative that we discuss ways to correct this and that women in developing countries have access to the tools and the services so they can have an important role in their countries. We must also remember that it isn't just the economy to which they are being denied access. It starts from the time that they are children. Oftentimes, women are not even registered at birth, putting their future and their well-being in danger. That is why I've always been proud to support my good friend Steve Shabbat in his efforts to pass the Girls Count Act, and thank you, Steve, for that, to ensure that these girls get birth certificates and are registered. My goodness, as a former Florida certified teacher, I know how important education is to all children. But for women in developing countries, before we talk about getting them access to financial tools, we really need to ensure that they have access to a real education. That's why I've authored bills to provide Pakistani girls and women access to scholarships so they can get the education they require, and why I'm co-sponsoring Steve's Preventing Girls' Access to Education Act. For women in developing countries, we need to start changing the fundamental ways in which they are viewed from the moment they are born if we're ever going to have a chance at their access to the financial services later on. And that's a tall task because of the legal and cultural barriers they often face. Women in about 18 of the world's economies, unfortunately, including many in the subcommittee that Mr. Deutsch and I head, the Middle East and North Africa subcommittee, require permission from their husbands or legal male guardians to work outside of the home, if they're even allowed to work at all. So I would ask the panel, how do you begin to make a change when so much discrimination is ingrained in the cultural norms and the societal norms and the values, when women from the time of birth are not viewed as equal to men? And how can we in the United States leverage our assistance and our role in the global stage effectively enough to promote the change that is needed? Thank you. Ambassador.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for those remarks and for your leadership. It is not all a dismal story. There is certainly a long road to climb and a journey that women are on all over the world, but there has indeed been progress, and a lot of the progress has come out of the leadership of our diplomatic and development efforts, as well as certainly those of others. And I think one of the key issues you mentioned is education. It is absolutely fundamental for a girl to be educated. Malala took a bullet just to make the case that girls have a right to an education. It is that mega change component because we know all of the things that come out of an educated girl in terms of the benefits that take place over her lifetime, the children she raises, the kind of job she has.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any of the other two ladies? Thank you, Dr. Suri.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I guess I would say I think there's two parts of this. Education, I completely agree. I think that's also tied to financial inclusion. We've got some work in Kenya showing that when we gave households access to loans for these water tanks where you can store water, the girls went back to school. So kind of understanding not just kind of what's, not just attitudes, but what is actually preventing the girls from going to school, what are they doing, and how do we try to alleviate those constraints can be important. I also want to mention some work on India, which is fascinating, where they required required some districts to have a third of women participation in local government, and they looked at the decisions then that the women made versus the men. And the women, of course, have different preferences than men. They chose different public goods and different investments than the men. Hard to weigh up which ones are better or worse. But what was really fascinating is they also did some surveys on the ground of people, and they saw that people's views of women started to change when women started to participate in local government and they saw women making decisions about what the community needed or not. So
Thank
I think
you very much.
that is also something.
And sorry we ran out of time, but next time. Thank you, Chairman Royce, and thank you, Mr. Engel, for convening this important hearing. And thank you to Lois Frankel. I know that she was one of the engines behind this hearing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Eliana. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I always been very interested in this topic. I grew up in a household where machismo was it. My father would not allow my brother and I to hang around the kitchen. And I still remember the day when I was helping my mother make the bed where he picked me up and he spanked me because I was helping my mother. He always said that was the woman's domain. But a funny thing happened along the way. At the age of 11, my parents and I and my brother, we came to America. My mother got a job first. All of a sudden, things changed in the house so completely. My father was in the kitchen helping her because she came in late. My father was helping out with the wash, which was to me, and I always used to tell my father, I said, whatever happened to all those things that you taught me in Cuba that I shouldn't do? And I think he was kind of embarrassed by the way things changed. And later on, he got a job, and all those things went down the tubes. I also remember my first day teaching. I taught in a school with a lot of Hispanic students, and since I was bilingual, I was a chaperone at the school dances. And the principal said, you have to come. And I used to hang around in a corner with about 12 mothers who used to come to the high school dances. So when you say to me that, I mean, it's fascinating, the whole, and I fortunately had two great college professors. I went to a Jesuit school in New Jersey, which was only men, but when I got there, it had changed, and I had the first professor, the woman professor ever, and the second woman professor. They were fascinating, and this topic was always brought up. But I cannot agree with you more that education and economic opportunity changes the whole formula. And I think that's what we should strive for when we want to help somebody. You know, there are a lot of things that we can do, but I think education and certainly economic opportunity, because I saw that my mother brought the first check, and the whole thing changed, I mean, overnight. And to this day, I find the whole thing fascinating. So I guess what can we do to continue to provide economic opportunity for women? Because I think that's the only way that you're going to be able to change it. And obviously education also. Especially in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's still pretty much, machismo is still pretty much alive in the Western Hemisphere in all these countries. Because I see, my district is obviously a very predominant Hispanic district I represent just about every country in the Western Hemisphere that speaks Spanish. And, and I hear these stories. So, and I'm concerned with some of these cuts that, for these programs for women, how we're going to impact that in the Western Hemisphere. So can you, sorry it takes so much time, but can you talk a little bit about it? We'll start with you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for that story. It's absolutely what we see on the ground. As soon as the financial situation shifts a little bit, the dynamic in the household changes, a lot of other things can change as well. I think I just would like to build on some of what we were talking about with education, because what we see far too often is some of that really fantastic benefit that we all know about educating girls get lost if we also don't prepare them financially. So in part of that education, giving them financial literacy skills, and what we're seeing in our work on the ground, also getting a savings account, ideally in their own names, as early as possible. We've been working with an NGO in Africa that's graduating, 180,000, 200,000 young girls from secondary school every year. Tremendous progress. But they're seeing those girls married within a year because they don't have savings, they don't have life skills, they're not financially prepared to go out in the world.
Yeah, I always figured that one of the issues that held my mother back was that. My mother was 13 and my father was 23 when they started going out. I always told my father, you're going to be put in jail in America if you did that. Can you?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I guess I'll just add on some of the stuff that was said earlier, and something that Mrs. Kandarian talked about. If you look at the mobile money story, the technology and the innovation was seeded by aid money, by a donor. It allowed the private sector to kind of de-risk what they were doing and provide a set of tools that affect women. I think thinking through how we provide that R&D capital for the private sector and emerging economies is really important, because they don't have R&D. They don't do R&D traditionally. But if we can de-risk private sector investments in these countries, I think we can get a whole set of new technologies and tools to women that I think will really benefit them.
I'm sorry I ran out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to point out that the leadership, Mr. Engel and Mr. Royce have, again, demonstrated that there's a lot of areas that we can work together on, and that we are choosing issues like this that are just somewhat out of the ordinary. And so I want to thank the leadership for this hearing today and making this issue. I'd like some more specifics from you. You're the experts, and I want to know what countries are the good guys and what countries are the bad guys. And I guess, first of all, what countries would you say are on the super good guy list, and what are the countries that are on the super bad guys list?
Well, I think, I don't know if I'd call them the good guys and the bad guys necessarily, but there are plenty of rankings today, Congressman. And whether it's the UNDP's Human Development Rankings or the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Rankings.
Okay.
Take the World Economic Forum. Nobody accuses them of being a women's organization. And yet they annually look at the gender gap between men and women on 4 metrics in any given country: health, access to education, economic participation, and political participation.
Okay.
And when you look at those rankings, the Scandinavian countries and others are at the top, and then keep going down, and you find a lot of the countries that are in the most difficult straits today, conflict-ridden, poverty-stricken, capturing the headlines in not the most favorable way, are the places where gender equality is clearly at the bottom.
So are there any poor countries? We're saying poor countries versus rich countries then. Are there any poor countries that have a really good a record on this?
You know, it's not, and that's a very good point, because if you look at the WEF's rankings, you'll find some anomalies in there. Countries perhaps in Latin America and Central America or in Africa, because they're looking at the gap based on what they have. And as they're closing the gap within the context of that country, they are making progress.
Okay, give me some specifics.
I don't have the rankings in front of me, unfortunately.
So who are the good guys? Okay, there's some good guys at the lower end of the scale, a lot of bad guys. And one of the reasons that their countries are poor is because they have oppressed women. And I think that it's very clear that if you oppress women, you're oppressing one half of your population, and thus you're cutting yourself off from a lot of economic activity. But do you have some names for me?
Well, you know, several years ago, the Arab Development Report was published, and it has been since updated by Arab intellectuals wrote that report. It had not inconsiderable impact in the region because one of the clear indices of why they were not progressing economically in ways that they should was the state of women's conditions.
Sure.
Lack of education.
I understand. I'm trying to get less philosophy out of you than some more specifics. I understand.
Well, I'm talking about the region.
Okay, give me some names of countries. We don't have any names of countries? Give me a name of a couple of bad guys we should have on our list. Say, hey, why do you treat women that way in your country?
Look at the situation in Pakistan, for example.
Okay, Pakistan.
Or the situation in Yemen. You know, these, and then look at the state of those countries. Certainly at the bottom in terms of equal opportunity and...
Thank you. That's what I was really looking for. Pakistan and Yemen, of course, let's keep that in mind when we're dealing with those countries. By the way, let me just note that women's role in the military in various places, the Kurds and the Israelis seem to have women playing a major role in the security of their country. Are there countries, other countries like that we can, the United States has really increased the role of women in our military, and who are the good guys and bad guys in terms of utilizing women within their government and their military?
You've raised another critically important issue, the participation of women in the security sector. I think there are some 7 or 8 ministers of defense now in the European countries who are really moving this agenda forward. As you mentioned, we are making some progress. It is still a significant problem in UN peacekeepers, for example. There are very few women in the ranks of peacekeepers, yet part of major part of their mission is the protection of civilians, and it's often women who are in the most difficult straits in the places where they're keeping the peace. In military service and in police service, whether it's in Afghanistan or other places of conflict, to raise the participation
Well,
of
let's
women.
just note, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and we note that here on Capitol Hill, it was a female police officer that saved the lives of several members of Congress who were under attack. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I was listening to my colleague Albio Siri's talk about his upbringing. When I think about my own upbringing in an immigrant household, both my parents worked, but my mom had multiple jobs, making sure me and my two older brothers got ready for school, making sure that we had something to eat, making sure that we did our homework, and the importance of empowering women to be kind of that glue. I guess I'd like to ask a couple questions. I think Ms. Iskandarian, you talked a little bit about kind of going cashless, and India is doing a pretty interesting experiment right now, and maybe it's not an experiment. It actually seems to be going fairly well, and I'd be curious about the thoughts of going to this cashless economy and digital economy, and the impact on that has, both bringing women but bringing everyone into the traditional economy. So if you
Yeah, it's truly remarkable, Congressman, what India has been able to accomplish, and the government has really just driven financial inclusion. They have, as I mentioned in my remarks, instituted this biometric system. So everybody has a thumbprint, and that's been available to men and women alike. There are some things that we love to see changed in this, because when the government is then looking at financial inclusion, they're looking at household financial inclusion. And so we don't always know, but when we dig into the data, that typically means that the husband has taken that biometric information and opened a bank account rather than than the wife. But not in all cases, and we're very excited about the opportunities. You probably heard recently about the demonetization. Right. India took several currency notes out of the system. It was particularly difficult for women who still were operating in cash and didn't necessarily have access to the technology for a variety of reasons, including cultural and social reasons. They didn't own the cell phone. So we're eager to make sure that women are not left behind in this exciting move towards the cashless economy.
Dr. Suri, did you want to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to add, and thank you for that question. I'll mention a couple of things on the digitization in India, which, like Mrs. Iskandarian said, has been impressive. When they started off, I really didn't think they'd succeed at giving most of their population a digital identity. I think there's a bunch of research now showing great gains to this. One has been, as they digitized people's identity, they digitized a bunch of the social welfare programs from the government. And this has dramatically reduced corruption in the government, because you can't have fake people anymore in the system, and I can't sign up Mrs. Iskandarian and just pay her on the side. So you see a reduction in corruption, and then accompanying that, we've seen some work where when women earn the money off the workfare programs, if it's tied to a bank account that they have, that is theirs, it increases their labor force participation and their earnings. So I think it can't be just digitization on its own, because as Ms. Iskandarian said, that doesn't mean necessarily financial inclusion in the way we think about it for women, and financial use. But when I can tie that digitization to now financial tools and other things, then you do see this benefit for women.
Ambassador.
Thanks, Congressman. One of the things that has always affected me is traveling throughout the developing world is how terrified women are that the meager earnings that they may have will not be safely kept, because either it will be taken from them within their household, or through bribes of one kind or another that they have to pay for essential needs. And this overriding concern is something that I think these changes that we're talking about this morning begin to really address in a serious way. And I think today you see more and more of the governments, as Dr. Suri said, taking their welfare payments, many of them projected to the woman, targeted to the woman for education and health and essential needs of her children. And increasingly, that's coming in a card. It's digitized in a card. So the cash is gone. She can't be targeted in the way she's used to being targeted and vulnerable. The corruption, as Dr. Suri said, begins to be addressed, and that's a serious problem everywhere, as we know. And she goes with that card to get those essential items that she needs for her family. So this is revolutionizing that great fear that most poor women have in keeping their earnings safe.
Great, fantastic. I yield back.
We go now to Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. This really has been fascinating to hear the cell phone use in Kenya. That was how incredible, how positive. And Dr. Suri, the House of Representatives, with the bipartisan leadership of Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Eliot Engel, has a long history of promoting women's economic empowerment in developing countries through various pieces of legislation, including funding for micro-enterprise development programs focused on women entrepreneurs, and last Congress's Global Food Security Act, which supported improved property rights and technical assistance for female farmers. In a time of limited resources, where should we be focusing our efforts now? Where can we get the best return on our investment?
Great. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think I would echo something Mrs. Skandarian said earlier, and something I've said already. One is measurement, 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 measurement. We're still figuring out what works effectively and what works best. And I think trying to encourage measurement. You know, we talked about property rights and how people have changed laws around property rights. Changing laws isn't enough because it might not actually be implemented, right? And so understanding whether those laws have actually trickled down to changing women's rights for inheritance is important. I don't think we have an answer to that. So I would say measurement is really important. Evaluation, understanding what works, and then investing in the things that work is really important. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier. There's not a lot of R&D capital type stuff in these countries. And so trying to be the provider of the risk, sort of the risk investment and the measurement kind of, let's figure out what works and then invest in that, allows us to kind of use that capital very effectively, and then the private sector can build on sort of the things we're finding. So that's where I would see it.
And we would look forward to each of you on any legislation that we pass for your advice on what we can do better. A side issue is that I've seen other organizations like the International Association of Credit Unions. I was president in, of all places, in Novosibirsk in Siberia, and it was so encouraging to me to see the establishment of credit unions where microloans were made to women to sell cosmetics door to door. At that time in the late 1990s, that was utterly revolutionary in post-Soviet Russian Federation. So over and over, so much can be done. And Ms. Eskandarian, widespread lack of official identification in developing countries disproportionately affects women and girls, without which it is hard for them to obtain even basic services such as a bank account. This committee has passed legislation, the Girls Count Act, to promote birth registration for girls in developing countries, but for these women who do not have a birth certificate or other official identification, what are some of the new technologies that are helping them to gain access to important financial tools?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, and thank you very much to the committee for having supported that legislation. The lack of a birth certificate, just stops a woman's progress right out of the gate, literally. So as we were referring earlier, the biometric identification tool is very, very exciting, and we're excited that there's going to be, sort of further South-South cooperation. India is now sort of going on the road with their technology. We do quite a bit of work in Nigeria where they've got a similar technology, but where India has literally a palm-sized piece of technology that they can take out into the field and get the fingerprint. In Nigeria, the machine is like the size of this table. So getting the technology right, even with that great idea, is absolutely critical. As I also mentioned in my remarks, something as simple, that's really not a technology, but something as simple as reducing know your customer requirements for somebody to open a bank account with a cell phone photo, basic identification, not, in Nigeria, there's a 150-page questionnaire that you have to fill out regardless of what you're trying to do with that bank account. When they instituted Know Your Customer requirements that were tiered to open simple savings accounts, you not only saw financial inclusion dramatically increase, but you saw the banks, the private sector banks, going in. It was now affordable for them to serve these customers because they didn't have those heavy documentary requirements.
And thank you for highlighting where it's working and also suggesting changes where I think certainly technology could be better. Thank you, and my time is up. And again, thank you so much for all of you being here today.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Ross and Mr. Ingo, for this hearing today. Terrific. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for all your work. I'm going to assume that you all agree that the President needs to fill this position of Ambassador of Global Women's Issues as soon as possible. That's something you all agree on? Yes? Okay. So, yes, you're all shaking your head yes. And Representative Torres asked me to associate herself with some of these remarks that I'm going to make and some of these questions. Thank you for your talking about trying to connect women to technology and their cell phones. But I think you would all agree that a cell phone is not a replacement for an IUD or a birth control pill, access to health care. It can help, I guess, get you the money, right? And that's what I want. A couple points that I would like you to touch on here is for women to be productive, they cannot just be reproductive, correct? Yet we've seen this administration expanding the global gag rule, zeroing out funding for family planning, cutting off funding for the UN Population Fund. And listen, I'm not just talking about abortion, okay? That's controversial. Let's just talk about someone being able to plan their families. I'd like you to touch on the impact of women not having full access to health care and being able to plan her own families, how that affects them economically. And the second thing I would like you to touch on is we've heard some talk about a new World Bank fund. We are giving $50 million to it. I'd like you to relate that to a women's fund. Yeah, I'd like you to relate, if you can, that to your discussion.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I couldn't say it better in terms of the critical nature of how these investments in women are interrelated. You can think of any American woman. If she doesn't have access to family planning, for example, if she voluntarily wants access to family planning, to be able to conduct her life, take care of her children, give them the best that she can provide, and succeed in her work, then she's constrained. She's severely constrained. A poor woman's problem is that much more greater. I have been in so many settings where women had one woman I remember vividly, 5 girls, 5 boys. She said to me, "This is too many children. I can't take care of them. I don't know what's going to happen to them. We have nothing." It is so significantly entwined with their futures, with their economic viability, with how they take care of their families. You can't work if you're sick. You can't work if you're so constrained. So that goes without saying as far as I'm concerned. In terms of the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative that Ivanka Trump's been associated with, and that is part of this World Bank partnership, I think you know, it's a good thing. It provides loan guarantees, which we have seen work significantly. Ms. Eskandarian has talked about ameliorating risks, for example. Banks will not make these loans to women, small businesses or medium-sized businesses, unless frequently there's a guarantee that they won't lose everything on that loan. And this is supposed to, with the bank's work, involve training as well as other aspects of financial support and related supports. And there have been commitments from other governments as well. But the point is, that's a good initiative, but it's if in isolation we cut everything else, then what has it achieved? And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. We can't just do one thing and expect magical results. We need to understand the complete person in these cases, what she represents for her country, what is in our vital interests, and make decisions accordingly.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. McCall of Texas, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today, all three. And I remember several years ago reading a book called Inside the Kingdom, My Life in Saudi Arabia, written by Carmen bin Laden. She was a European woman who married into quite a family that everybody knows about today. But she talked about 1979 particularly, and how life was in the kingdom before the Ayatollah came into power in Iran and changed the entire region, and then how life was after that event in 1979. And we all know it changed Iran, but it also fundamentally changed the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, really rolling back time as it pertained to women. And